I should tell you a little bit about how healthcare system works for mitochondrial disease in the US as well, because as you know, they always say it takes a village to take care of a child. It also takes a village to take care of a Mito patient. And I think the only way we can move forward in this field is if we all work together globally and internationally. And what a better way to do that than by learning from our successes and mistakes. And even though we're miles apart, I think we share similar burdens and similar challenges that we discussed yesterday with the Australian mitochondrial experts. So I wanted to share with you how we do things in the US and how we can collaborate together with our Australian colleagues to make this work for everyone. So we have several entities in the US. They all strive for better clinical care for mitochondrial disease patients, research, advocacy. Ultimately, we all want to find that cure and make your life more bearable and improve your quality of life. So the way we do that in the US is through many different organs. So we have always in the middle the patients and their families, because that's the most important part. But we also have the clinicians and the medical clinics. We have the patient advocacy group. We have professional societies that try to improve the standards of care, research consortia, researchers, industry partners, and more recently we also started including legislators and federal governments. So I'm going to try very quickly to go through this because I'm the only thing standing between your lunch and the break. So patients and families, when people think about the US, they might think it's one big country, but we're actually 50 different states, 5 different territories, and multiple islands. And each of these states is a kind of its own country with their own legislation, their own rules, their own insurances. So it's pretty hard to coordinate even amongst ourselves, and that has been a challenge over the years. In terms of clinicians and clinic, there are around 49 self-reported mitochondrial experts in the US, but no one has ever really looked or assessed what their level of expertise is, what their education is, whether they are legitimate experts or not. So we don't really know how many doctors are out there that take care of Mito patients. What we know is that Mito patients are usually either seen by geneticists, by metabolic specialists, by neuropediatrician, or by neuromuscular adult physicians. So there's a plethora of different specialties that take care of mitochondrial disease patients. We also have a very uneven clinical distribution of care in the US, where most of the centers and the big academic research centers are located in the coasts, and there's a big gap in the middle, kind of like what's happening here. And Sean was reminding me that in Australia, there's no one living in the middle. We do have people living in the middle in the US. And most clinics do see both adult and children, although some clinics might be restricted by their internal rules about whether they can see both or can only be limited to seeing one person, one kind of age group or not. And that sometimes depends on your board certification. Some of us are board certified to see pediatric patients, and some are board certified in adults, and some are for both. So when the mitochondrial disease community started getting together, one of the first things that developed are these patient advocacy group, because as it might be your experience here, once you get that diagnosis, you're kind of left to fend for yourself. You get out of your meeting and you're like, what is mitochondrial disease? Where do I turn for information? And that's how our first patient advocacy group developed in the US. There were initially more than 20 different small groups that were created by parents and family members. So you had your Current Sears Foundation, or your Current Sears group, and your Cox deficiency group, and your this and that. And then in the mid-90s, Chuck Moen, who has had a daughter with mitochondrial disease, brought all these groups together and united them. And that's how the biggest mitochondrial disease foundation in the US was created, and was called the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, because it united all these smaller 20 or so groups in one bigger group, and that's the equivalent of the AMDF that you have here in Australia. We also have 2 other major advocacy groups, the Mitochondrial Disease Action Committee, which we call Mito Action, and the Foundation of Mitochondrial Medicine. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the differences that they have and what they do. Of course, we do have other smaller advocacy groups regional, so state-specific or town-specific, and they are also very helpful, but these are the three major national ones. So the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation is very similar to the AMDF. So this is the funding body that supports research, supports clinical fellowship and research fellowship. It's the one that organizes the annual scientific meeting like you have here. It's also the one that is very active in terms of talking to legislators and trying to improve research funding on the federal level. It's also the one that Dr. Bruce Cohen talked about is funding, is championing this Lee syndrome roadmap project. This is their website. It's umdf.org. They have a wealth of information on their website, and I noticed that it's also listed in the booklet that you have up front. So people can always go there and look up what we have online. And I should say that all of these three advocacy groups are really going through a revamping of their educational material because it's been years and things change over time. So they're really trying to make an effort into keeping only updated information on their website. Mito Action started off as a more northeastern New England advocacy group and then extended to different other chapters nationwide. It's more focused on the day-to-day struggles of the patient, so they have a hotline that you can call. There's a nurse on the other end. They can answer more medical questions. They give a lot of funding to patients, supporting travel, supporting supplement intake if the family cannot afford it. They also do children camps during the summer and during vacation, and they are more socially involved, more community-based, as opposed to the UMDF, which is more national. The Foundation of Mitochondrial Medicine is the smaller of the three, and they are not specifically focused on primary mitochondrial disease, but more on mitochondrial dysfunction as a whole. So they not only deal with mitochondrial disease, but they also do Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and ALS and other neurodegenerative disorders where mitochondria plays a role in the disease. What they do is they also try to fund research, and they also try to support local clinics if they need funding to hire a nurse or attract new junior faculty members that would like to start clinics in an area that has no clinics available. So all three of them have been working collaboratively over the last few years, which is great for us to see because as we collaborate, the more we do together, the less redundancy we have and the more we get for the limited money that we have. Which brings me to the professional societies. So once the community started organizing and we started knowing more about mitochondrial disease because of that advocacy, we were diagnosing more patients. And the physicians started struggling with what do we do with these patients? We don't have enough information about how to treat them or how to manage them. So two of our senior physicians, Dr. Richard Haas and Bob Navio, got together and created in 1998 the Mitochondrial Medicine Society, which I will focus a little bit on. And then around the same time, another researcher, Dr. Kashav Singh, created the Mitochondrial Research Society to represent the basic science of the field. So this is the Mitochondrial Medicine Society website. You're all welcome to go and take a look. Everything on the website is freely available, publicly available. So you can click on any of the tabs here, and we also have a wealth of educational material. This is more geared towards professionals, so it might not be as lay for you to understand, but it's helpful if you have a question and you're in an area where you don't have a mitochondrial disease expert to refer them to this website because they can find scientific publication about specific issues with diagnosis and management of the mitochondrial disease patient. Okay. So the main focus and goal of the Mitochondrial Medicine Society is really to advance education research. And in the last 4 years, we also started wanting to go more global because we understood the importance of collaborating and working together. Mitochondrial disease doesn't care whether you're Australian, American, European, or wherever you live. it's the same mitochondrial disease, but we do have limitations locally with our resources, but there's nothing to prevent us from getting together to try to develop the same guidelines that can work everywhere in the world. So the way we started doing that is to initially really look at ourselves within the US and see what was available to us, what was going on. Because as I said initially, since the creation of the Mitochondrial Medicine Society, no one has really went back and asked people what they were doing, how they were practicing mitochondrial medicine. So in 2013 and 2014, we really looked retrospectively at what was going on in the US. And what we've noticed is that we had more than 30 doctors that self-proclaimed to be mitochondrial disease expert. And every time we asked anything about how they managed their patient, we got 36 different answers. And that showed us that we were not really harmonized at all. And as Dr. Cohen was showing you the supplement list, that was one of the major things that was really discrepant between the doctors. Some of them prescribed 20 supplements, some prescribed 10, some prescribed 1. We all did things very differently because we had nothing scientifically published really to tell us what to do. So over the years, we tried to establish some guidelines to harmonize. The problem when you're working with rare disease is that you don't have enough patient numbers and you don't have enough years following these patients to have an understanding of how the disease works. When you take something like heart disease or diabetes, you have millions of people worldwide that have the disease, and the disease is very unified because it's the same diabetes everywhere. There aren't different, even if you have different genes causing different types of diabetes, the end result is the same. If you have enough patients, and we've known about diabetes for decades, so we have a lot of that natural history that Dr. Cohen was talking about. And it's much easier to come up with guidelines because we have the numbers, we have the years of experience. But when it comes to rare disease and mitochondrial disease specifically, we didn't have the numbers, we had a very heterogeneous group of patients, and we didn't have the years of experience. So we kind of couldn't rely on information that was scientific, and what we had to rely on was really the expertise of each of the physicians that each had seen 20, 30, 40, 100 patients and what their experience was seeing those patients. So that's what we call the consensus as opposed to an evidence-based guideline. And that led us to publish this publication in 2015 that really focused on what we thought was the optimal way of diagnosing patient. And we also included in this publication the way we should manage patients when they had acute problems. For example, if they had an acute stroke or if they had an infection and they needed to be admitted to the hospital or they needed anesthesia, what kind of precautions they needed. So all of these were in that 2015 publication. And then a couple of years later, we asked the community, and everyone told us that they had benefited from the information that we provided in this publication, and asked whether we could come up with another consensus guideline statement to tell them what to do on a day-to-day basis to manage the patient to prevent things from happening, which has led to this Patient Care Standard for Primary Mitochondrial Disease consensus statement that was published in 2017. And I'm happy to say that yesterday when I spoke to my Australian colleagues that they were working on ratifying this to make it more suitable for the Australian patient, because we do understand that things work differently in the US and in Australia. So when we say here that a patient might need an MRI, it might not always be available in every hospital in Australia. So there are certain regional differences that need to be taken into account. So hopefully you will have your own Australian version pretty soon to use. And on the website, if you click on the education tab, you have a list of all these publications that came out of the Mitochondrial Medicine Society across the years. So if you click on it, you will get the full article for free, and you can look at it, you can print it, you can take it to your doctor if you'd like. So after the professional society was created, many years later, it became evident that to come up with those evidence-based guidelines, we needed to get together and gather the numbers that we needed to study those patients on a long-term basis. And our National Institute of Health recognized recognized that need and funded what we call these research consortia. So the one that pertains to mitochondrial disease specifically is called the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium. And this is the website. Again, there is a wealth of information over here. There's a list of all the sites that participate. But this is basically a federally funded effort to create these consortia for rare diseases. So as opposed to having smaller clinic having 10 or 15 patients each, can we bring them all together under this consortium umbrella and put all these patients together so that we can now have much larger numbers that we can follow over years to know exactly what happens to a Lee syndrome patient when we follow them after 5 years, what happens to the child with Lee syndrome when they grow up to become an adult if they do survive their disease. So we have 16 different sites in the US and Canada that are part of this North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium, and these are the sites here. And again, you always see this cluster in the northeast and a little bit on the coast, but nothing much in the middle. So what this consortium does is really brings together clinician and clinical and research investigators together. It does fund a clinical fellowship program, so this is a one-year fellowship program where the fellows usually rotate through several sites within the consortium. They are exposed to the clinics, they see patients, they are also exposed to clinical trial methodology, to clinical research methodology, so that when they finish their fellowship, they are very knowledgeable in mitochondrial disease and they can enter the workforce. We also partner with patient and the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation because we want to hear that patient community voice. And we also have a clinical registry that at this point in time has around 1,400 patients. They are both adult and children and adult, male and female. We also have a biobank, so when we enroll our patients in the registry, we ask them to donate blood, tissue, or whatever other tissue they are willing to donate. We do pilot studies, so some of the studies that we're trying to do is, like you have here, the genomic testing. We're trying to offer genomic testing for all our patients so that everyone has a molecular diagnosis. We're also trying to see whether we can come up with biomarkers or new diagnostic testing, also outcome measures to help us with the clinical trials. And most importantly, because this has been ongoing since 2011, we now have 7 years of longitudinal follow-up and a wealth of clinical information on each of these patients that we can go back and look at to see exactly what happens to the heart of these kind of patients, what happens to the brain, and we follow the MRI result, and what does that tell us? Okay, so the consortia will only work if we collaborate with other researchers across the country and internationally. So we have multiple researchers across the US. Some are focused on the basic science, some are focused on the translational science, and some are focused on the clinical science. So we try to collaborate with each other. We try to use the information that we collect with the consortium. And we also try to do international collaboration. Like Dr. Cohen was showing you, we're only going to get there to the cure if we all work together internationally and put all our knowledge and efforts in the same pot. We also started more actively collaborating with industry in the past few years. The EPI-743 trial was one of the seminal trials that started this whole clinical trial fever in the mitochondrial disease community. But since then, we've had many other clinical trials. We actually now have a phase 3 clinical trial for mitochondrial myopathy, and you do have a site here in Australia. So inquire with your doctor whether this is something that could work for you. But this won't be possible if we didn't collaborate with pharmaceutical companies to try really to engage the patient to enter these clinical trials. We also collaborate with other diagnostic laboratories to improve the diagnostic process, come up with larger panel for genetic testing. Again, that remains an issue even in the US. Not all insurance companies cover for genetic testing, and we have to navigate those challenges on a daily basis in our clinics, but that's where we need to be heading. So collaborating with these laboratories to have support system in place, so for when the patient cannot afford to pay for their genetic testing, they get some relief or some discount or something that will help them out. It is also something that is ongoing in the US. And finally, the legislators and the federal government, we do try to connect with them on a regular basis, and that's the reason how the UMDF was able to increase the funding, the dollar funding for mitochondrial diseases in the US, and now we're getting more agencies, federal agencies, to fund research for mitochondrial disease. It also helps us introduce new legislation for example, whole exome sequencing is still considered a part of the United States as an experimental procedure. So if we can convince the insurers and the legislator that it's not experimental, everyone needs to get one, that is a good outcome. Also, in terms of therapies, supplements are not considered therapies in the US, they are considered foods, so because they are freely available on the shelf, none of the insurance company wants to pay for them. And it becomes very costly for patients if they have 3-4 members of their families on supplements to pay that $200 a month or more bill just for the supplement. So if we can legislate and have insurance companies pay for the patient, that's a good success for us. So that's the landscape in general of how the mitochondrial disease community is really structured in the US. But now we came full circle, and after we've established all of these, we came back in the Mitochondrial Medicine Society and tried to look at what's going on. Now that we have these guidelines and all these registries and people are collaborating, is that really improving the clinical care for the patient or not? And because the patients and the families are always at the center, we went back and asked our patients, how do you feel your clinical care is going right now? And we were very surprised to see that 54.5% of the patients didn't think that their general practitioner or pediatrician understood mitochondrial disease or was taking good care of them. And that was devastating in 2015 to hear that. We were also told that 27.7% of all the people surveyed did not have a mitochondrial disease expert. They either lived in an area where there was none available, or they couldn't afford to travel to see one. They also, if they had one, sometimes it was very hard to get access to that person because, as is the problem here, our wait time is usually months and months. So even if you called your doctor and wanted to see them, sometimes you couldn't be seen in a timely manner. So those were very sad gaps that we discovered were in our healthcare system. And 31.7% of all the patients we asked said that they felt that no one was really taking care of the healthcare issue, and they felt that they were their own coordinators, their own doctors. That we saw mothers traveling with lots of files of their children on them because every time they went to the doctor, they needed to educate the doctor and show all the medical record. And that was a big burden for these patients, and that made them very dissatisfied with their care. 74.3% were not satisfied with their care, and 44.6% felt that that was impacting their own health because of increased anxiety, depression, and anger, that the system was not working for them. So that led us to really think about how can we optimize mitochondrial care in the US, because on paper everything looked peachy to us. We were happy about ourselves, but in reality it wasn't really working that well for the patients. So we, in the Mitochondrial Medicine Society, were thinking about how can we deliver standardized and excellent care for our patient? How can we improve the quality and consistency of these services delivered, no matter where you lived, whether you lived on the coast or in the middle of the country? And how can we improve the care coordination, which was very important for the patient that we asked? And then how do we continue to improve and build on that clinical research infrastructure and the natural history? So we wanted to think about, can we create centers of excellence for mitochondrial disease in the US? And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel because there are so many other rare disease centers of excellence. Some of them are very successful, some of them are not successful. So we went out and we asked those centers. The good one, the bad ones, the one that failed, the one that succeeded, we wanted to know it all. We wanted to really learn from the successes and learn from the failures so we don't replicate those failures. So we also wanted to establish a new network that was based on best practices that worked for mitochondrial disease specifically and not just appropriate something that was working for another disease that wasn't mitochondrial disease, acknowledging that mitochondrial disease was very heterogeneous and there wasn't the one side that would fit all. And we wanted to do this in stepwise because we understood that just going in right away and establishing these big centers it is not going to be sustainable over the long term, so we wanted to have something that we can enjoy for a long, long time, as opposed to being happy of establishing something and having to lose it a few years later. So in terms of planning, we went back to the patients and the families, and we did focus groups. We brought in patients and their families into rooms, and we sat down with them for hours, and we asked them, if you had all the money in the world and you wanted to establish your best center or best clinic, how would that clinic look like to you? What would you want to see in those clinics? And we had a lot of asks. We actually had a big board, and we asked everyone to write down all their wish lists. And people said a lot of things, and I have a list to show you. But for the most, everyone agreed that they wanted a multidisciplinary care and better social support and care coordination. And to show you some of the answers that we received, they wanted a primary MD providing their care, and they wanted that person to be either a geneticist or a neurologist because they felt that those two specialties are the most knowledgeable about mitochondrial disease. They wanted to have those subspecialists available in the same clinic where they see their mitochondrial disease expert. They wanted regular team meetings so that all their doctors could talk about their care at once and get a unified answer from all of their doctors, as opposed to going from one doctor to another and trying to convey the information they received and understand what the management should look like. So then we, after we talked to the patient, we thought, okay, we understand that there's a huge need from the patient perspective, but do the physician feel the same? If we come up with these centers, would those physicians be able to maintain and work in these centers, or would they think that this is too burdensome or too difficult to do? So we did ask the clinician, we did send out a survey through the Mitochondrial Medicine Society membership, and we asked the physician whether this was a good idea or not. And 93% of the physicians that we asked felt that this was a good idea. And interestingly, we asked a lot of questions to these physicians, and we were surprised to see how coordinated the physicians' responses were to what the patient wanted, because the physician also told us that they wanted the clinics to be staffed by geneticists and neurologists. They wanted coordinated care because that made their lives also easier, that they wanted to be able to see both children and adults, that it didn't make sense to just, once the pediatric patient became adult, to just discharge them from the clinic to someone that didn't understand mitochondrial disease. So that was very, very encouraging to us to see that everyone was really enthusiastic about establishing these centers. So after thinking about a lot of the details, we started involving the advocacy group, because they were to be a big part of any center of excellence, and they are our link to the community, to the patients, and to the families, and we needed them to be involved. So we did talk to the three big advocacy groups, and we brought them on board, and we created the steering committee that for a year and a half met every week and decided on how are we going to establish these centers. So we came up with selection criteria for these centers that took into account the expertise of the directors of these centers, and that expertise was measured in terms of the number of patients with primary mitochondrial disease that they saw, the level, their specialty, their level of involvement in scientific publication and attending conferences that were specific to mitochondrial disease, their academic engagement, the availability of comprehensive care resources within those clinics where these specialists were, and whether those physicians were ready to work with the advocacy group and the community as a whole. And then in the late 2017, we did put out a request for application, and we were happy to receive 26 different applications from the US. We thought that our measure of success would be to get 10 to 15 applications, and we were very happy to receive 26. So those applications were reviewed, and this is the summary of the 23 that really met the standard. of being really serious applications. And what we've discovered is that 14 of these centers, or would-be centers, were staffed by geneticists and some by neurologists. They all were employed by academic center except for one site that did virtual telemedicine. It was a private practice. Most sites had part-time site coordinators and few had full-time coordinators. The wait time was very long, 2 to 120 days for a new appointment and 1 in 14 days for urgent appointments. Most sites, 11 out of the 23, were allowed to see both pediatric and adult, but the rest had a transition plan in place. What surprises is that many of the doctors at these sites did not really track their patients. So part of the application was for us asking how many patients do you follow, and a lot of people had a hard time figuring out how many they followed. So these are the sites that applied. Again, the clusters, the same clusters. From these 23, 21 sites were awarded were approved to become part of what we call the Mitochondrial Care Network, and they were announced at our UMDF June meeting in 2018. We have different levels of centers. We have expert centers that have a full Mitochondrial Care Network approved stamp, and we have affiliate centers. These are the centers that were good enough but didn't really quite rise to the standards that we want an excellent center to be. So they have they can improve themselves and reapply in a couple of years and get that higher level of within the network. We did develop a website. It doesn't have a lot of things yet because we're just starting. But these are our seals of approval for each of the centers. And the next steps are really to come up with a medical advisory board to really steer the network into what are the next steps in terms of improving care, what are the gaps that we have to fill and how do we fill them. We kind of started doing that. We have 8 pilot projects that are ongoing, and most of them are looking at the existing infrastructure, where some of the very urgent gaps are and how we are going to fix them. And the ultimate goal is really to improve the delivery of care using those Mitochondrial Medicine Society guidelines and management, and to create true evidence-based scientific evidence that will allow us to write newer publication, hopefully international publications, in terms of how to manage, diagnose, and treat the mitochondrial disease patient. Our longer term is really to create a good infrastructure to support those clinical care, clinical trial projects. So everyone at every center, no matter where they are, can have access to a clinical trial and a potential hope for a cure for their disease. And that closes the loop for now for us in the US. I added another box here, which is the MCN. We're very excited about this, and we'll see how things go in the next few years. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.